Hi, this video presentation is basic tips on how to perform Kari Koskinen compliant pre-employment background checks for all of you managers that have rental property in the state of Minnesota. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover. What is the Kari Koskinen law? Who does it apply to? What are the BCA's repositories that are a required search from this law? What crimes preclude employment? What kind of recommended additional searches might you perform? And then how do you do this type of background screening efficiently and effectively? So first things first, what is the Kari Koskinen law? Well, the Kari Koskinen law was named after a woman named Kari Koskinen, and it is a Minnesota-specific law, and it was named after this woman who was unfortunately stabbed and murdered in 1994 by her building manager. The law applies to any person who has properties in the state of Minnesota that is going to hire an employee that has access to an occupied renter's apartment. Now, the key word here is may have access. So even if they're a person who doesn't primarily go into apartments, if they have access to the keys to that person's occupied unit, you have to do a Kari Koskinen-based background check. The requirements are a little complex. The first thing is that you have to do a search of Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's public and private database. And if the employee has not lived in the state of Minnesota for the last 10 consecutive years, you also have to have that person fingerprinted and have an FBI-based criminal search done on those fingerprints. So, the BCA has two separate databases. One is called their public database, which is available to the general public, and the other is called their private database, and this is generally restricted and not available to the public, but because of this statute, you are required to access that. The public database is limited to conviction records for the past 15 years, while the private database includes convictions going back to 30 years, and it also includes juvenile records. So here's a comparison of the two. Again, you'll see that the private database has a fee imposed for accessing it as opposed to the public database, which is free. You have to have a special Kari Koskinen release authorization form with you in order to access those private database records. You can't access those over the internet. You can only do those in person or by mail. And again, even though it's not actually explicitly stated in the statute, you are required to do a search of both of the BCA's databases. Now, the fingerprinting requirement. Again, I said before that you are required, if the applicant hasn't lived in the state of Minnesota for the last 10 consecutive years, to also fingerprint your applicant. To do that, you have to get the blue fingerprinting forms that the BCA supplies at no cost. You can have the fingerprints rolled by any local police department, although it seems that you do have to set an appointment for this, and the fees vary from departments from about $10 to $25 on average. Subsequent to that, you need to submit these cards through the BCA to have the FBI-based criminal search performed, and the BCA does charge $24.50 to process these cards through the FBI. So again, to do Kari Koskinen compliant background checks, your minimum cost to the BCA is the $15 search to access the private database records, and then an additional $24.50 if you have to do the fingerprint-based searches. Now, it's key to remember that if you have to do a fingerprint-based search, you have to submit those at the same time that you're submitting the BCA private database searches, because the BCA will charge you either way. So you want to make sure that you do those simultaneously. When you get your search results back from the FBI based on those fingerprints, you're not going to get the results or the details of the results. The only thing you're going to get is a letter saying whether or not this applicant passes or fails the requirement under the statute to be hired under the Kari Koskinen law. What types of crimes preclude employment? Well, they vary. And you can see on this slide that it's basically looking at felony level convictions, or I shouldn't say convictions, violations. So we're looking at violent types of crimes. First, second, and third degree homicide, manslaughter, kidnapping, assault, sexual conduct, robbery, burglary, terroristic threats, arson, stalking, that kind of thing. It also includes convictions for attempts to commit those types of crimes. What are some additional provisions? Well, In most cases, you may never hire an applicant that's been convicted at a felony level or attempt felony level of any of those types of crimes, but others have a statute or a requirement in there that at least 10 years have to have passed from the disposition date of the record. Anybody who was hired before July of 1995, you can remain, they can still be your employee, but you have to notify your tenants if you choose to keep them as your employee. And then if your tenants are uncomfortable with living in your building based on the fact that you're hiring somebody who violates these crimes, they can break their lease within 14 days. Now, this is the minimum search that the law provides. I will also tell you, however, though, that because the FBI only gives you a pass or fail, that means that somebody could have been convicted of a crime, but it wasn't one of these Kari Koskinen specific crimes, and so you might be hiring somebody that is a convicted felon or gross misdemeanor offender, but it's not of those violent types of crimes. So if you actually want to see the results of some of these searches, the first thing I would suggest is you do an identity search or a social security number trace on that applicant to find out where they've really been living over the last 10 to 15 years, because people aren't always forthright about where they've been living. The other thing is I would suggest doing a county level criminal search in addition to these statewide repository level searches. The problem with statewide repositories is that they're only as good as the counties that report information. They don't originate the data, so if you want to go right to the origination source, you need to go to the counties. Do a nationwide sex offender search in addition to a criminal search, because if somebody's a registered sex offender from another state, you're required to notify your tenant base about that. And then finally, do an out-of-state criminal history search above and beyond this FBI search. You can access nationwide criminal searches, state-by-state searches, and even federal-level criminal searches, those crimes prosecuted by the FBI or the BATF or the DEA, without fingerprints, and actually see the details of those criminal records. How do you do this type of background screening efficiently? Well, the first thing is you have to get your hands on those blue fingerprint cards from the BCA. That's as simple as giving them a call or writing to them and asking for, whatever quantity you might need. 10 to 20 of these should last you a very long time. You have to obtain or create your own Kari Koskinen release form. Again, if you go to, if you just Google Kari Koskinen background checks, you should find a blank Koskinen release form, or ask a screening company in the state of Minnesota for one of these and they'll be happy to supply it for you. Keep the statute handy so that you can refer back to which crimes preclude employment. And then, of course, my recommendation, being that I operate a third-party screening agency, is let us take care of this compliance for you, because failure to be compliant, although it's only a petty misdemeanor, your biggest problem might be any kind of a lawsuit that could arise as a result of non-compliance if you hired the wrong person and they were to, heaven forbid, do harm to a tenant. If you need any more information about Kari Koskinen compliant background checks or any type of residential or pre-employment screening, don't hesitate to give us a call or send me an email, and I'd be happy to give you any additional information you're looking for. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, and successful leasing.